Devery holds a degree, let's see it, are you still holding it? No. Okay. In history from the University of Utah and an MA in publishing from George Washington University. He has written and edited a number of books, including the trilogy, I guess we could say, from Signature Books. And by the way, a big shout out always to Signature Books for their support and for publishing fine books in Mormon studies. And we have a number of people from Signature Books tonight, including George Smith. And George, I'm not sure if what your title is, but I know you're the publisher. But he has been instrumental in supporting the cause of Mormon studies for many, many years, and we really appreciate that support. Devery co-edited with Gary Bergera Joseph Smith's Quorum of the Anointed, the Nauvoo Endowment Company's I should have a hat here. I could either pull out a rabbit or have a stone in it. He did by himself the development of LDS Temple Worship III in that trilogy, extremely important books on those subjects. He also did a book that has nothing to do with Mormon studies, but a fine biography and the story of Emmett Till, who was killed in the 50s, and as I understand it, is it going to be a single or a series?
10 hours.
Okay, 10 hours of documentary.
Documentary.
Not a documentary?
No, it's a miniseries.
Oh, it's a mockument. No, it's a miniseries, sorry. On HBO that will be coming out.
Not HBO.
I thought you said it was HBO.
Well, now it's going to be Apple TV.
Okay, now it's going to be somebody else. Fox 13 here in Utah. Sorry, I thought it was HBO. That's changed, apparently. This is the main book I assume that you came to hear about tonight. Salt Lake School of the Prophets, 1867 to 1883, that Devery worked on for a number of years, and it was a number of years ago. He probably his main claim to fame is that he used to be employed here. I was going to say he worked here, but it would be more accurate to say he was employed here, probably. Dan, sorry, I know I usually reserve that for you, but it fits. No, we were lucky to have Devery with us for a number of years at Benchmark Books, and that's my why I'm such a lucky guy is that I can associate with authors, editors, scholars, and many who have made their mark in Mormon studies, and we're just grateful to be a small part of that whole effort. So with that, I'd like to now turn the time over to Devery Anderson, and everybody keep positive thoughts. He'll be able to get through the whole thing. Test it out, and let's see, put that in your pocket. So see if that works.
So, can you hear me okay with this? He's quite the germaphobe, so the fact that he touched me at all right now is amazing. So, and I do have these for afterwards when I sign books, just in case you're fearful. I'll put these on. But, yeah, and it's weird to be filmed as I'm sick here, so just knowing this is going to be on YouTube is kind of creeping me out a little bit. But that's okay. Well,
voice is sexy.
What's that?
The deeper voice is sexy.
Oh, okay. Or it means I smoke, one of the two.
You're smoking hot.
Okay. Even better. All right, well, this book was many years in the making. The Salt Lake School of the Prophets, and I'm sure you've heard of the School of the Prophets. Not sure in what era you're most familiar with it. My guess is most of us are familiar with it from the Kirtland period, when Joseph Smith established the School of the Prophets there. And that period is not covered in the book as far as the minutes go. Touch upon it in the introduction to give some background to the School of the Prophets that Brigham Young established. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the Kirtland period just to introduce that here, because I think it's important, because when we look at the School of the Prophets coming full circle in 1883, we have to kind of have an understanding of the Kirtland period. So Joseph Smith received some revelations in December of 1832 and also January of 1833 that established the School of the Prophets. And the first meeting of the school was held in Kirtland above the Newell K. Whitney store. That's where the meetings were held initially. 14 men were part of that original school. And some events at the School of the Prophets are kind of well known from the Kirtland period. What's the one thing that we kind of, when we think of School of the Prophets, Newell K. Whitney store, what's the one thing we kind of think about? Word of wisdom, almost every time. And the word of wisdom was given there. And also Joseph Smith established the ordinance of washing of feet, which was a part of that Kirtland School of the Prophets. And the interesting thing about that as well, which we'll talk a little bit more about, some of these organizations like School of the Prophets, Council of 50, the Quorum of the Anointed, which is the subject of one of the books that Gary and I did, we have this overlap really, or something that gets established there and it kind of takes off on its own later on. In Kirtland, the washing of feet was part of the School of the Prophets, but then washings and anointings became part of the Kirtland Temple later on. And then, of course, then those ordinances kind of went off on their own in Nauvoo and that with in the Nauvoo. Above the Red Brick Store, when the Quorum of the Anointed was established and that. And so we have these different groups, these different quorums, these different gatherings. School of Prophets was a little unique. Early on, with Joseph Smith, of course, there was the need for spiritual instruction. These men were getting prepared to go on missions and that, but then also there was the secular learning that became part of the School of the Prophets. The Kirtland period, it lasted sporadically between 1833 and 1837. Parley P. Pratt established a school in Independence as well, which didn't last very long, but he was over that for a little while. Kind of an offshoot of Joseph's school in Kirtland. And so we have this combination, and I suppose another thing we remember about the Kirtland School is some of the stuff that was taught, some of the secular learning that went on there. Who was the teacher that they brought in and what did he teach? One kind of stands out.
Hebrew.
What's that?
Satius in Hebrew?
Yeah, and the reason I asked is I couldn't remember how to pronounce the names. I figured if somebody else said it, kind of saved me from looking stupid. So no, I'm teasing. That's how you pronounce it. So they had these Hebrew classes, and other men taught, they taught mathematics and other things like that. So this school established right away this kind of secular end and this spiritual end that was kind of all wrapped around this. When it talked about establishing a house of learning, a house of faith, all that, it was considering this type of instruction. And so School of Prophets ended 1837. A lot was happening then. Eventually the church had its later Missouri period in the far west area. And everything that happened there, we know that there wasn't really a lot of time and motivation probably to continue this at that point. And then Joseph Smith goes to Liberty Jail and then on to Nauvoo from there. And then other things get established in Nauvoo. So there was this period from 1837 to 1867 where we had none of this. But it was canonized, it was in the Revelation. So it wasn't easy to just turn, at least from the church leaders' perspective, to just turn their back on this. It was going to come back to them again. Well, Brigham Young, as you know, the Saints leave Nauvoo in 1846, get established here in 1847, and we're spending several years just trying to survive, get set up here, and have our own self-sufficient economy in isolation from the rest of the world. But But things start happening that really keep us from being, to enjoy that isolation for very long. And eventually it was going to end, and we knew that. A few things happened. Of course, there was a civil war. Then there was the completion of the telegraph, and also the one thing looming over them was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Non-Mormon, or as they referred to, Gentile merchants, had already established themselves in the valley. And interaction between the Mormons and the merchants that were non-Mormon was often tense and not very welcome. And so they knew, with just what experience they'd had thus far with the Transcontinental Railroad completing, that this was going to change drastically at that point, that we were going to lose all of that. So in 1867, and don't really know why Brigham Young started the School of Prophets again at that point, other than the University of Deseret, which became the University of Utah, was being reestablished. It was established in 1850. It didn't last too long. I think it was a couple years later that, due to lack of funds and that, it closed for several years. But in 1867, they were going to reestablish that, and Brigham Young decided to reestablish the School of Prophets in conjunction with the reestablishment of the University of Deseret, later University of Utah. And Jordan, did you know it was called the University of Deseret once upon a time? So he's a student there, and I'm an alumni, so should know these things. And so Brigham Young establishes it then. And it's important to kind of know what he had, at least what he had in mind. He saw this theology class as part of this, but in time, of course, they went their separate ways. And they envisioned a secular school as well, a secular class as well as the theological one. The secular one went off on its own. The theological one went off on its own. And they split, but the theological one was still known as the School of the Prophets. Now, Brigham Young, I want to read a couple of things here that are in the book, but that kind of establish this background. In a speech in February 8th, and I don't think I have the right date on this, let's see here. Anyway, early on while he's establishing this, he explains why. He says, "We've established a school in Salt Lake City for the instruction of the elders of Israel in the doctrines which are contained in the Bible, Book of Mormon, and Book of Doctrine and Covenants. And that is also the place where questions may be asked and instruction given touching all doctrines and principles that may be entertained by them. That is also the place where correction may be given and explanations be made upon all matters which pertain to the temporal and spiritual lives of the saints." So here was this emphasis on the temporal again, emphasis on the spiritual. One thing Brigham Young did not do is reestablish the ordinance of washing of feet. And I think at this point, because temple ordinances had evolved and temples were the place where these were happening, there was really no need for that. I think he saw that as an evolution. Later on, John Taylor wouldn't see it that way. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. But so that was a separate thing. And one thing that this book doesn't do, which it couldn't do, because it would be a multi-volume work and we really couldn't have done that. But when Brigham Young established a School of the Prophets in Utah in 1867, 14 other schools were established throughout the territory. Payson, Provo, St. George, several others. And most of those, and maybe all of them, I'm not sure, because I haven't examined them, but minutes of those schools exist. And there was often interaction between the two. Leaders from the school here would speak there to implement decisions that the school here made. And so to really fully understand the School of the Prophets, you kind of have to really understand what was going on in these other schools. This book just concentrates on the Salt Lake School, which is sufficient for what we wanted to do. But to really grasp it properly, I think those minutes need to be examined as well at some point. When Brigham Young established a school, they established some rules that went along with it. I want to read a few of these because when we think of rules for the school, we think of conduct within the school, within the classes. But these rules actually kind of governed your behavior inside and out. So it was almost like a temple recommend in a lot of ways to be able to abide by these and to be admitted into the school. There were 17 rules. I won't read them all, I'll read a few. All members must be at the school punctually at the hour appointed unless excused by the president or can afterwards show good and sufficient reasons for their absence. They must not take the name of, so that's pretty much applies to conduct at the school. They must not take the name of deity in vain or speak lightly of his character. They must observe and keep the word of wisdom. They must pray with their families evening and morning, must provide for their families and not abuse them, nor be quarrelsome with or speak evil of each other or their neighbors. They're required to observe personal cleanliness and must preserve themselves in all chastity by refraining from adultery, whoredom, and lust. They must not go after hay, go to the canyons, nor hunt their animals, nor perform any other labor on the Sabbath day, but must rest and attend meeting in the tabernacle, in their wards, etc., etc. They must pay their tithing. If any member of the school has difficulty with other members, he must go and be reconciled with him before attending the school. They must not find fault with nor rebuke any of the members of the school. In all matters, their dealings should be as much as possible with those in full fellowship of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They should not hereafter incur debt beyond their means for paying as they agree, and must honestly pay their debts already incurred. That which is not their own they must not take. That which they borrow they must return. They must not let down their bars, open their gate, nor make gaps in their fences through which their animals can pass to the injury of their neighbor. So they kind of thought of everything here. And no member of the school has the privilege of inviting his friends to attend without being permitted to do so by the president. And whosoever passes in the school must be preserved inviolate. So these rules apply. They were read often anytime new members were admitted. They were read again and agreed upon. People had to agree to them. And over time, the Salt Lake School, established in 1867, grew to a membership of about 1,000. And when you think about that, made it almost just about the largest organization within the church at the time. Every active adult male was expected to be a member, and they pretty much were. And so it created this bond, really, which, and when you read the minutes, you'll see very often the camaraderie that was developed, that people wanted to be part of these meetings, no matter the setting, no matter what they were discussing. Just being there with the others created a bond that was important. But the school developed problems in time, which we'll talk about too, which was hard. Which, when you think about it, it's hard to really be otherwise when you think of a school of 1,000 members who are expected to abide by certain rules, who are expected to do certain things, expected not to do certain things. You're really setting yourself up for trouble in a lot of ways, and that's kind of what happened. The format of the meetings varied. Theology and spiritual matters were common areas of discussion, as was community issues and personal problems. And I just randomly picked a few of the days, kind of grouped together, to see what kind of topics they discussed. February of 1868, February 3rd, 14th, and 17th, just to get an idea of what they discussed here. And February 3rd, quote, "The School of the Prophets met in Salt Lake City. The subject of astrology, witches, and witchcraft was discussed. President Brigham Young declared that there were witches in the midst of the people, by whose influence suffering and distress were wrought upon many." So that's kind of an interesting one. Then 10 days later, quote, "President Brigham Young investigated the cause of division in the late Salt Lake City election when the name of LeGrand Young was stricken out and the name of Edwin D. Woolley substituted, and he cried strongly against the spirit of division at the election polls." The School of Prophets was the group that nominated people for public office and then ran the campaigns and the elections and saw that these people that they nominated were elected. So their job was quite a busy one and quite an important one from their perspective, at least, controlling the elections the way they did. And if there was if someone made and people were nominated and for office and basically called in the same way you'd be called in a church calling. You just found out that you were being nominated to public office, and that was going to be what you were going to be up to for the next few years or whatever. But and if there was a change made like this, Brigham Young was upset that someone else just substituted another name. he got really upset about it. So there was the witchcraft one week, they're talking about the election the next week, and he's upset about this name that was nominated and pulled and substituted. Then 3 days later, quote, President Daniel H. Wills and Elder George Q. Cannon made statements in full confession relative to their not being energetic and alive sufficiently to the importance of putting down the division at the election polls. The School of the Prophets was a place, oh hey, how you doing?
Good, good.
Come on in.
Oh, I didn't want to disturb you. Excuse me.
This guy is so cool. He was Jabari Parker's high school basketball coach. You never know he played basketball.
No.
And Jordan can talk to him afterwards because he'll love that. So, and then, so there was a place also where people made confession, where you had to stand and confess your wrongs. One of the biggest, and we're familiar with Orson Pratt, some of his conflicts with Brigham Young. It was interesting in 2 back-to-back meetings in 1868. On June 27th, quote, Brother Orson Pratt made a confession of his error in printing Mother Lucy Smith's book without first consulting President Young. We know the story there, a lot of us do. Lucy Mack Smith wrote this book. Brigham Young didn't like it, and Orson Pratt published it. Brigham Young got upset about that. There was controversy about that. Extracts from Brother Pratt's writings were also read. And Orson Pratt and Brigham Young disagreed on doctrine a lot as well. Then on July 4th, quote, Elder Orson Pratt made a full confession before the school of his error in opposing doctrines revealed. Said whenever he had done so and excused himself because of what was written in Scripture, his mind became darkened and he felt bad. He asked forgiveness of President Young, of the 12, and of the whole school. Any idea what those doctrines might have been that Orson Pratt and Brigham Young disagreed about? You would know that, wouldn't you? Yeah, it was the Adam God doctrine. And right after that, President Young expressed his satisfaction with Elder Pratt's confession and preached in relation to Adam. So Brigham Young just got right to it then. They got Orson out of the way, he confessed his error, and then bam, Brigham was right away preaching on it. And so, but that setting in the School of the Prophets where this confession of his wrong, of what he saw then as his error in doctrine, was a place where these kind of things happened. And then that kind of confession and being accepted and reinstated by the rest of the school was a very common occurrence in the School of the Prophets. The School of the Prophets needs to be recognized as a body that made decisions and implemented them. The size of the School of the Prophets in Salt Lake provided the strength to carry this out. One of the things, again, this Council of 50 existed they overlapped, and the School of the Prophets overlapped somewhat. I think in the 67, 68, the School of the Prophets, or the Council of 50 was in existence. They oversaw some of the cooperative endeavors of the church, but they were carried out by the School of the Prophets. Here you've got this Council of 50 limited in number. You've got the School of the Prophets at this stage, 1,000 members. They were able to carry out and implement decisions that were made within the School of the Prophets. So that strength in numbers was important early on to do a lot of things that they wanted to do. A lot of this was in local politics. As I mentioned, they nominated candidates, but they also fought with their local government leaders. As you know, Brigham Young was replaced as governor, and a whole string of non-Mormon governors were put in to take his place. And how did the church like these non-Mormon governors that were in Utah at the time? Didn't really get along all that well. School of Prophets was an important part of carrying out territorial public affairs. And polygamy was probably the big one. As far as some of the conflicts that arose, we're familiar with the Morrill Act of 1862, which was signed into law in 1862. Abraham Lincoln signed it, but he didn't enforce it. There wasn't any funds to enforce it, and nobody cared to. And how would you enforce it anyway, with the Mormons all the way out here and the rest of this union elsewhere? To allocate funds for that and enforce it would have been very hard. And so Abraham Lincoln didn't really do anything about it. Just kind of turned a blind eye, kind of gave Brigham Young permission to just kind of business as usual. But in 1869, what that did was open the door. They knew that more was coming. They knew they were under the eye of the federal government, that they couldn't carry on their way of life much longer, especially with the railroad coming in that. It was going to be very difficult. By 1869, a new bill, the Quorum bill, passed the House. And it didn't pass the Senate in the end, but it between passing the House and while it was being fought over in the Senate and that, church leaders locally decided right away to, Daniel H. Wells favored a mass meeting of the elders to discuss on legal grounds the unconstitutionality of passing such a bill as Cullum's. And it was then moved by George Q. Cannon, seconded by Wilford Woodruff, and carried unanimously that we hold a mass meeting on Thursday next at this place at 1 p.m. The bill died in the Senate, but in Utah the opposition, as organized and carried out by this massive adult male population in Utah, had a major effect on it in Utah, and of the conflict between church leaders, church members, and government officials. George Woods was the governor of Utah that had a lot of issues with Brigham Young and church leaders, and it had to have been frustrating for him. He vetoed a call for a constitutional convention. And at a meeting of the School of the Prophets, Daniel Wells moved that they hold it anyway. He moved and, quote, moved and was unanimously carried that we hold a convention, appoint officers, and draft a constitution for admission into the Union as a state. We will go right along without any regard to those who try to stand in our way, because they are possessed with a little brief authority. They saw their authority as temporary. They weren't going to do anything that they wanted them to do. And so this support within the Council of 50 was, I mean, in the end, obviously these fights were going to continue and things weren't going to really go their way for long, but that strength and those numbers were a way that they were able to do that. The schools encouraged members to buy guns and ammunition in order to protect themselves from unlawful arrests. And minutes of the school on July 1st, 1874, another example of demonstrating the school defying Governor Wood's attempt to prohibit a display of military units at the 1871 July 4th celebration. Quote, Bishop Alonzo H. Raleigh spoke of the corruption of our government, both politically, religiously, and morally, as much so, perhaps, as any nation that was ever destroyed on account of its iniquities, referred to the proclamation issued in this morning's paper by the active governor, Secretary George A. Black, to prohibit any military procession on July 1st, as announced in the program by the committee. He strongly recommended the quiet observance of the original program and leave the result in the hands of God. Don't let us be afraid to take a firm stand, and let us only know we are right, then go ahead. So this defiance was very common, and it took root and spread as a result of calls to action within the School of the Prophets. And we've talked about the Transcontinental Railroad, and that non-Mormon merchants would be coming in, non-Mormons settling in the valley, and the church's response to that was really don't associate with Gentile merchants. Don't purchase from them. Don't have anything to do with them, because if they can't sell, they'll leave. And that was the hope. Brigham Young and church leaders preached constantly about avoiding trade in this way, and not only in trade, but any other association. They talk a lot about just Gentile influence, just within society and within the culture and that. Very often they're preaching about fashions, Gentile fashions, or something that they didn't want the youth or others getting or involved with or trying to take on for themselves. You'll see Gentiles around and seeing what they're wearing, and it's the same thing. Like today, you see youth see what other people are wearing. It's like, I gotta have that, Mom, please, type thing. And it was no different really back then. So that influence in fashion, in education, this call constantly to avoid letting your children be educated by non-Mormon teachers. So there, all of that stuff, this avoidance of any influence that could come either by enhancing their, helping them economically, or helping them spread their own views and their own way of life amongst the Mormons. These are things they had to start dealing with, and as they did, they were quite fearful about everything and what the results could be. So in a way, it was unprecedented territory, but they could see, they feared the worst, really, and that's one of the things that they had to deal with. In fact, the call became, one example on October 3rd, 1868, the president of the school voted that those who dealt with outsiders should be cut off from the church. The president declared that he had tried to control the merchants, speaking of the Mormon merchants, but could not do it, said they could go to hell, and if they did not turn short corner. So he had to deal with the Mormon merchants, the non-Mormon merchants. It was all kind of intertwined because each benefited from the other, depending if you're buying, selling, and that. And so his call was to both sides. School of the Prophets really couldn't excommunicate anybody because they had high council courts set up for that. And so that was done. And the most prominent example of that happening, members of the School of the Prophets who didn't like the one rule or the one-man rule set up with Brigham Young that allowed for this control with spiritual and temporal matters were William Godby and Elias L.T. Harrison, who just simply thought that that was something that shouldn't be expected of us, that his authority only ran so far, Brigham Young's authority only ran so far. Others, like George D. Watt and some others, felt the same way, and their attendance at the School of Prophets, they kind of went inactive in it, and that they were called in to explain themselves. Most of these brethren, confessed the error of their ways, but Harrison and Godby did not. And they felt that they had a right to do what they were doing, that, again, your authority only goes so far. We have a right to proceed temporally how we want, and just to subject in every aspect of our lives to what a church leader wants. They just didn't agree with that. So they were called before a church court in October of 68, I believe. And they were cut off from the church. And so and then of course they founded their own church. They were the Utah Magazine, which is very critical of Brigham Young and church policy, and that eventually became the Salt Lake Tribune. And that. So the Godbyites is a whole other story, but that whole thing was played out, at least in the School of the Prophets, as far as what their error was, and that they in their defense of themselves. And then the court minutes are an appendix in this book as well, and they're very interesting. And it's interesting, when I was doing a history of dialogue several years ago, reading some correspondence between Gene England and Henry B. Eyring, who's now in the First Presidency, Gene asked Henry B. Eyring if he would join the dialogue board. And Henry Eyring responded and said, I think what you're doing is a great thing. I think the Lord probably wants it, but too many people see it as a modern Godbyites, and so I don't want anything to do with it. And so that was one of the things that happened as a result of that. Or that's the kind of mindset that developed, and the Godbyites kind of set that stage for the future, those who, is it right to go against the counsel of a leader in this area, in temporal matters and that. And we can thank the Godbyites for kind of setting the stage for that and having people worry decades later, century later. Now, Cooperative Endeavors, as we mentioned, the Council of 50 kind of set those up, and they were implemented through the School of the Prophets. One of the most prominent one, I suppose. Now there were several cooperative endeavors set up throughout the territory. Merchants, in merchandising, manufacturing, many areas, and they, being in different places, they all had their own kind of rules, and they were successful to greater degrees than others, depending on who was in charge, that type of thing. And but the big one that that we probably that stands out for all of us is ZCMI. Now that was established within the School of the Prophets. And at the School of the Prophets, I'll quote here from October 24th, 1868. At the School of the Prophets held in Salt Lake City, a preamble and constitution of Zion's Cooperative Institution were read by sections and discussed and unanimously approved. A few weeks later, on November 14th, at the School of the Prophets, Elder Franklin D. Richards presented the bylaws of Zion's Mercantile Institution. The Constitution was read and the bylaws read and approved. And the aim through ZCMI was to fill it with a variety of goods, making it America's first department store, and to sell them at costs as low as possible, and for the profits to be divided among the people. And so that was kind of the Brigham Young's baby when it came to cooperative ventures, and that there was that one, there were those that were spread throughout the state. All of this was a precursor to the United Order. The United Order was a higher law, also referred to as the Order of Enoch. That was discussed in the School of Prophets a lot. It wasn't established till 1874, but this goal of achieving and living by this higher order was constantly being taught, and that these other things are just stepping stones to that. And so that was in the minds of everybody in the School of Prophets. Again, 1,000 people part of this school. You were admitted by ticket. The deliberations were supposed to be secret. How well is that going to go in a group of 1,000 people? I mean, how many of us knew about the 2-hour block before that was announced? I mean, didn't we all kind of know about that? It was like all over the place. Well, same kind of thing happened there. Deliberations were supposed to be secret, and people were losing their admission cards. And so the big fear was that, that's like losing your temple record with someone picking it up and just going to the temple. And so, because of all of that, Brigham Young kind of abruptly ended the School of the Prophets in 1872, cited these reasons, saying there's too much leakage, people are losing their cards, and so many are now inactive. The attendance had diminished quite a bit. So he dissolved it, but reestablished it a few months later. So in August of 1872, just suddenly at one of the meetings, he said, okay, that's it, we're done. But then in November, he reestablished it, but he tried to learn from some of the mistakes of the past. Reestablished it, and to enter it this time, you had to have, certain people were called right off the bat to be members. It never exceeded 234 members. So it went from about the size of a state conference to the size of a ward, which is still quite a few if you want people to keep things secret, because this time around, the first time around, not only was the school's deliberations were secret, the second time around, the existence of the school itself was supposed to be a secret. And so people didn't even know it existed. And so that was part of what Brigham Young thought was going to be a better way to go on this. And also, if there was any leakage, he said right off the bat that if we learn of any leakage, that's such a weird way to say that, but if we learn of any, talking about about these meetings, we will dissolve the school until the person who did the leaking comes forward and confesses. And so that kind of scared people a little bit into keeping a secret this time around. The second School of the Prophets under Brigham Young was different as well, in that there were still the temporal issues that they dealt with regularly, but there was a greater emphasis on spiritual matters, theology, and that. That's when we see a greater move towards people coming and asking certain questions, or people, them proposing a certain topic and people kind of talking, giving their views on certain gospel matters and that. And that's where we see a lot more people coming forward saying, this school means a lot to me, because when I'm here with my brethren, it just, it means so much, and I can't get this anywhere else, and it gives me strength and all of that. So it took on that greater spiritual part, but it still had the temporal duties that it had to deal with. So that never really went away. The first school lasted for 4.5 years. The second school lasted about 1.5 years, from 1872, or from November 1872 until June of 1874. And again, that's during the period when all this talk about the United Order and this goal of the United Order is coming along, and to where that begins to get established. The first United Order was in St. George, established several months before the Salt Lake United Order. But when the Salt Lake United Order was established, the School of the Prophets just became assimilated into that. And and the notes and the minutes of the Salt Lake United Order are also an appendix in this book. So it just kind of transitioned from the one to the other. And if you see the notes, you'll see or the minutes, you'll see the similarity, but with this different emphasis now on the United Order. United Orders didn't last all that long either. There were several of them, Salt Lake, St. George, several others. Some just lasted, I mean, most of them dissolved rather quickly. I think a few hung on into the 80s. There were some that lasted a while that are known to have been somewhat more successful. But with that, the School of Prophets really ended. Now, John Taylor, we talked about Joseph Smith's version. John Taylor comes along in 1883, and he claims a revelation as well that this needs to be reestablished, but he also looks back to Joseph Smith's time and said, you know, this was the command of the Lord. We can't really not implement it, or we can't just ignore it. And so, and he did an interesting thing. He wanted it to have that same emphasis that Joseph Smith's school had. By then, you know, Brigham Young's dead by now. He dies in 1877, and so 1883. It's a little bit different now because John Taylor reestablishes this, but they have several meetings where they're doing some research looking into Joseph Smith's school. And he saved me some research too, because one of the things we learned is that he looked into Joseph Smith's school, he looked into Brigham Young's schools, and he assigned George Buchanan and George Reynolds to examine the records. Came back and said there are really no records for between 1867 and 1870, which was nice that he did that for me because it saved me a lot of trouble looking for them. So the 1867 through 70 records of the School of the Prophets, for the most part, come from the journal history of the church. So chapter 1 of this book are these short summaries for the most part. There was one random minutes of one meeting that had the flavor and everything of the later minutes that was just there. So they think they took minutes, but most of them were lost except one that's just showed up for us just in the last few months that we're able to include in here. But for the most part, the 1867 through 70 minutes are from the journal history. So George Cannon and George Reynolds said that, yes, there are no minutes for that. And they did talk to people who were involved with Joseph Smith's school to try to understand what it was that Joseph Smith was trying to accomplish. The one person who was still around was Zebedee Coltrane. He was a member of Joseph Smith's school in 1833. In 1883, he's still around, and he remembers it. He talks to these guys about the revelation on the word of wisdom, because he was there. He talks about the washing of feet that Joseph Smith performed as an ordinance and why he performed it in that. And so, in reestablishing this now, John Taylor decides that that's the way it needs to be this time around. Need to implement the washing of feet, and there was some debate there because some of the brethren thought, well, that was a preliminary ordinance that was just kind of meant as a springboard and an evolution for the later temple ordinances. That's all done in the temple now, separate. We don't need that anymore. And some thought, no, we still do. That's a separate ordinance, has a different meaning. And so there was some debate there. They decided to re-implement it. And they had these organizational meetings, and one meeting of the actual School of the Prophets when they organized, when John Taylor put on a towel, went around to several of the brethren there, and all of them, I can't remember the number, I think it was 24 or 38, I can't remember right now. This is in the endowment house. So this is where they held the organizational meeting of the School of the Prophets in 1883, because, and that assumes that those going through the being part of the School of the Prophets then, all had to have been endowed and received these temple ordinances because they're doing it in the endowment house. John Taylor washes the feet of those present, and he washes Zebedee Coltrane's feet, even though he had it done once before. Then Zebedee Coltrane in turn washes John Taylor's feet. And it was a very spiritual moment for them, and they talk about how that kind of created this bond and helped things go full circle from where Joseph Smith started to where it was going to start anew. With this spiritual emphasis, the salutation that was part of the original School of the Prophets, the way they would greet each other, John Taylor implemented that and made sure that that was done at this opening meeting. So he had the washing of feet, he had the salutation, and after that initial meeting, they never met again. And it's kind of odd that they wouldn't have. I don't think they intended not to, because when a few months later the St. George School of Prophets was organized, and they did the washing of feet there in the St. George Temple. So they were supposed to exist simultaneously. In fact, the notes of the St. George School of Prophets, which are included in the appendix here as well, they talk about we have two schools now, one in Salt Lake and this one. But the Salt Lake one wasn't meeting anymore. They met in October of 1883. The St. George School of the Prophets meet in December, and they're still talking like the Salt Lake School still is in existence, but it's dormant and never meets again. We can assume it has something to do with the fact that anti-polygamy activity was starting. The following year it was going to really start up again, but I think in anticipation of that, the records are silent, but we can speculate that was the reason. It had to have something to do with it because John Taylor received a revelation. He was all gung-ho, he wanted this to start, and then it just dies after one meeting. But has it go on in St. George for a few meetings, and that one ends as well. And that ended the School of the Prophets completely at that point in 1883. So the bulk of it was of the book, and the bulk of, and the part that has actual minutes is the Salt Lake School of the Prophets between 1867 and 1874. Doctrines and theology and teachings discussed in the School of the Prophets include Christ and his atonement, the Adam-God doctrine, the Book of Mormon, tithing is a big one, word of wisdom, a lot of emphasis and talk and discussion on that, apostasy, worldliness and dress and entertainment, and even burial planning. There was a few meetings where the brethren had to each week talk about what their burial plans were, and they would get called up and discuss that. So some of these temporal, spiritual subjects kind of, you can see how they kind of relate, and that's how they saw it as well. So in summary, the organization of the School of Prophets and its existence from 1867 to 74 provided the means for the church to maintain control over their government, despite the federal government having taken over and putting pressure on the saints to conform to mainstream American values. Members learned to implement decisions of a temporal nature, as well as to govern their lives in a spiritual manner that meant much to them on an individual level. When members talked about how much meeting with their brethren meant to them, it was the spiritual aspect, this brotherhood, this camaraderie that meant most to them. Yet there are many lessons in groupthink to be learned, and this body can be studied with that in mind. One-man rule in spiritual and temporal matters and the emergence of the Godbeites have been lessons in individual freedom and abuse of power on one hand, and of faith and obedience that only the most faithful adherents to a cause can recognize on the other. Thank you.
You okay to do a question?
Yeah.
Okay, just go ahead and questions.
Claire.
What was the salutation?
Oh, glad you asked. It's in here. I didn't memorize it, so if you don't mind, I will look it up.
Is it the one in the DNC?
Yeah, it actually is. But let me, in fact, that might be where he pulled it from here. Oh yeah. Art thou, it's on page XX in the introduction as well. But it is verse 133 in DNC 88. Art thou a brother or brethren? I salute you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, in token or remembrance of the everlasting covenant, in which covenant I receive you to fellowship, in a determination that is fixed, immovable, and unchangeable, to be your friend and brother through the grace of God in the bonds of love, to walk in all the commandments of God, blameless in thanksgiving, forever and ever. Amen. So, yeah, that's what they heard quite a bit. So. Yes?
In your observation, did they talk at all about women and their place and non-place and such a thing?
You repeat it.
Yeah, just the place of women. And some of the ones that come to mind, of course, are just, well, they talk about polygamy and whether it's essential, whether, I think there was some about, let's see, one of the, and maybe someone else here has examined the minutes can think of some of these, but I know there was, and this would apply to women, whether polygamy is essential. And there was more argument about that, more diverse views than I was expecting. Even Brigham Young came along and said, it doesn't matter if you have one wife or many wives, as long as you're living the gospel. So maybe for some women that was, sigh of relief that came along that way. Other issues regarding them, let me just see what comes up in the index here, if there's something under women that'll trigger something here. Oh, women aren't even in the index, so they don't even get discussed in the book, so sorry. Maybe we should look up females, ladies, something, you know. I don't know. Yes, Greg. Oh.
The common narrative of the church is that the School of the Prophets later became priesthood meeting for on, but they don't. The church kind of skips over the Utah period of School of the Prophets and doesn't say they're the predecessor of priesthood meeting that we have today. Any ideas why they don't really talk about the LDS Church about the Utah period of the School of the Prophets very much?
Well, a few things. I mean, the Kirtland School, of course, was Joseph Smith's baby, and you know we have the stuff in the canon that we can refer right back to. And I think, and the minutes, and then one of the things I should have mentioned in this is that the minutes for this were closed for a long time. When I started this in 2006, we had a transcript, Edith Romney transcript, that I think had been available from the Leonard Arrington papers. I'm not positive. But the church made the actual originals, you know, they scanned them, put them online. We asked them to do that, but usually when they do it as a result of something you ask, they'll send an email saying, your request has been fulfilled, here's the link. These just showed up after a while after requesting it, so I don't know if it was just coincidence or what. But these weren't really available for a long time, so the Salt Lake School of the Prophets wasn't really all that well known. And since we had the canon, what we knew was in the canon, and we could point to those reminiscences of in Kirtland and kind of its relationship to the Kirtland Temple, there was that greater spiritual aspect that you could really put your finger on early on, because we have this command in the DNC to establish this and what its purpose was. And I think it just was tied in memory to the Kirtland period, and that's how they saw it. So, but there's so much in the Utah period that because the Utah one lasted longer, had a bigger influence, but it had a different purpose at the same time. You know, I mean, it wasn't the exact purpose of the original, although Brigham Young pointed to Joseph Smith as having started this. There's so much more. I mean, how do you really turn the Salt Lake School of the Prophets with all the political stuff that they were doing and all of that, and some of the issues with one-man rule, you know, under Brigham Young, that a lot of people found very satisfying and some people didn't, and just the intertwining with politics and defiance of government and all that. I doubt they would want us using that as a model too much for current priesthood meetings. Although it'd be kind of fun. So. Yes.
The Logan Temple, which was dedicated in 1884, they kind of had schools and a lot of similar things as this School of the Prophet. Do you think that they modeled that off of, so like where they had speakers and they talked about, and I know that polygamy was an issue then.
You talk about the time that the temple was,
yeah, well,
like the use of the temple.
Yeah, well, and they wanted to call it a school to protect it because they didn't want it to be seized because of the anti-polygamy.
Well, I know Logan had a School of the Prophets. One of the things I should have mentioned too is that from 1867 to 72, there was a Salt Lake School and these 14 other ones in larger communities. So Logan, Parowan, Provo, St. George, all these other places. When Brigham Young closed the Salt Lake School in August of 72, he closed them all. When he reopened a few months later and under a new format with lesser members in Salt Lake, he didn't open the other schools. So after 1872, there were no schools anywhere but Salt Lake until briefly in St. George in 1883. So anything they would have done in Logan, they could have patterned after when they had a school that closed by 1872. But I didn't do any examination of their minutes and what the influence would have been in the community if someone wanted to try to preserve something like that later on. I just don't have that. Didn't look at those minutes at all. So it could be, they could have set the stage for something like that that they tried to emulate later. So. Yes.
How many people would meet at once in a single room?
Well, they met in various places. You know, they met in the old tabernacle. That was there's photos of it in here, but I'm not sure how many the old tabernacle held. Anybody know? But it would have had held enough to hold the Salt Lake School at its peak. And they met in, as it grew, they met in various places. They met in the 14th Ward meeting house a lot. They met in the council house. But as it grew, they met in the old tabernacle. And then later on, they met in City Hall quite a bit as well. And so there are various places. And I think they would meet where the school, the Salt Lake School, they could hold those who, anybody who was going to come if they anticipated. Like we were talking about, attendance had dropped off by the time the Salt Lake School closed briefly in 1872. Attendance had dropped off. But they held it wherever they could, hold everybody that was going to come. So they didn't have to do it in individual classes and things like that. They could meet as a body. Clear? Yeah.
This may be a little bit out of the scope of your book, but was there any, do you know anything about the inspiration for the original School of the Prophets? Were there any other Christian groups in America that had a School of the Prophets, or that were doing a washing of the feet or anything like that? Or do you know, or is that beyond the minutes?
Yeah, I actually touched on that briefly in the introduction here. And most of that information came from an article by Dorowski, what's his first name? It was the school, with the Joseph Smith papers. He did an article in, I think it was BYU Studies, on the School of the Prophets in Puritan history, I believe it was. I'll just read this I think it's just a paragraph. The idea for the School of the Prophets predated Joseph Smith. Harvard and Yale were initially seminaries where clergymen were trained, and they were sometimes referred to as schools of the prophets, drawing on the Bible, 1 Samuel 19, 18 to 24. By the time the First Great Awakening occurred in the 1870s, suspicions regarding secularism in elite educational institutions prompted the founding of rival schools, which created the term prophet in referring to teachers of religion. All of these schools functioned as seminaries at first and built up the secular structures around the divinity school core as time went on. So there was that, they were referred to as schools of the prophets if there was this ministerial training. Now, whether Joseph Smith knew that or any of that, I don't know. And then there's also, we talked a little bit about here, I think Matt Groh did a really good article years ago, or did a paper at a seminar that was published in a collection edited by Richard Bushman, about different groups performing the ritual of washing of feet. They did it for different reasons. And that talk about in here briefly as well from Matt Groh. I think I just like a paragraph in here, I'll just read. Smith introduced the washing of feet as performed by Jesus for his disciples. The gesture had been picked up by my eyes aren't too good right now. In the earliest Christian churches, and was still being practiced here and there in the 1830s, although generally as a sign of humility rather than purification and cleansing. So that was the purpose in Mormonism. So he had a different purpose, just this act of humility on the part of, like when the Pope washed his feet and things like that. It was criticized in the 16th century by Martin Luther, who saw it as a contrived servility, whereas Mennonites thought it was an important sacrament from primitive Christianity. The Pittsburgh Baptist Church under Walter Scott, with which Sidney Rigdon had associated as a minister, performed feet washing as a gesture of brotherly love and hospitality. After Smith had ritually washed everyone's feet, he told them to do the same, and he pronounced them all clean from the blood of this generation. So Joseph Smith, there was that act of being purified. Others had different reasons for doing it, but they all traced it back to Jesus doing it in the New Testament, and for humility or whatever they wanted attached to it. So. And that purification part really allowed it to become part, that allowed washings and anointings to become part of a temple ritual that had, that same purpose. And so that it had that aspect, not just an act of humility, made a big difference in Mormonism. So. Is that it?
Go ahead.
Oh.
So can you speak to the different cultural, cultural feeling of like Joseph's period, John Taylor's, and Brigham's, like as far as openness to other different views?
Views.
So So yeah, if people disagreed, like Orson Pratt, how was Joseph about that when people had differing views?
Well, as far as the School of Prophets go, I'm not sure if that even came up in the school. He called these men together to prepare them on missions, and this was for some of them was their first experience, and it was done in an educational setting, and so they were there to be taught. And most of them were, at that point, had only been members of the church, the maximum for any of them, a couple of years, and so they approached it differently just by them being students. They were there to be taught, and they were all being prepared to go on missions and that. And so I don't recall any conflicts so much. Maybe there was some, but nothing comes to mind right now. And then, of course, the secular learning part of it that he implemented with Hebrew and with mathematics and other things like that. Again, for a lot of these people, this was their first. And Richard Bushman talked about that. And I have a quote I put from Bushman in here, which I thought is really good because it kind of takes away, and it kind of sets the stage where there wouldn't really be much conflict. It's just a brief paragraph, and it's right at the end of the Joe Smith section. Richard Bushman summed up the institution this way, quote, "The School of the Prophets tells more about the desired texture of Joseph's holy society than anything he had done thus far, and more of what he was up against. The directions to quell excessive laughter and all light-mindedness implicitly reflect the rough-hewn characters who had joined him in this great cause. Few were polished, and he would never teach them gentility, but he wanted order, peace, and virtue." And that was what he wanted, and that's how they responded. And so the whole setup of his school didn't really allow for, by Brigham Young's day, they were having major conflicts with the federal officials who were there to control them, and they wanted things their way. They were worried about the end of isolationism here, all this stuff, and it was just a whole different setup. And so to really compare them in that way, it's impossible. But as a foundation, Joseph's school, you can point to it, but as far as how it was conducted and how the people responded is night and day, I think. So.
All right, let's give him a hand.